Last Friday, the US military put out a press release. No music, no drama, just numbers on a page. Most news channels skipped right past it. But if you actually stop and read what it says, you'll see something huge. In 1 week, the US Navy stopped 30 ships from reaching Iran. Not with headlines, not with explosions. Just quiet, repeated force, day after day. And that number might matter more than any missile strike this entire war has seen. Last Friday, US Central Command released a short update. It read like something out of a government filing cabinet. Plain, boring, and easy to ignore. Most news outlets buried it deep in their coverage, if they mentioned it at all. But that update deserves way more attention than it got, because once you break down what it actually says, this might be one of the most important moments in the entire war with Iran. Here's what it said. As of the end of July, American forces had turned away 30 commercial ships that tried to break through the naval blockade around Iran. On top of that, 2 ships that ignored warnings were disabled outright. 2 more were boarded, so U.S. forces could check they were actually following the rules. 30 ships. Stopped one at a time. Turned around in open water by a navy that has been quietly choking off Iran's trade for months, largely out of the public eye. Now, before we go further, you need to understand exactly where this is all happening, because the location itself is the whole reason this story matters. This is all taking place in the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its tightest point, it's only about 33 kilometers wide. That's it. That's the width of the passage. And yet, something close to 1/5 of all the oil and fuel products shipped around the entire planet passes through that exact stretch of water. Think about what that actually means. Whoever controls the ships moving through that strait isn't just messing with Iran's economy. They're standing next to a lever connected to gas prices, shipping costs, and fuel supplies on every continent on Earth. A blockade here doesn't stay local. It touches almost everyone, everywhere, whether they realize it or not. So that's the stage this story is playing out on. Now here's what we're actually going to walk through. First, we're going to look at how this blockade actually works in practice. Not the idea of it, but the real physical mechanics of stopping ships day after day. Or second, we're going to look at what it's doing to Iran's economy in ways that don't show up in one dramatic video clip or one viral headline. And third, we're going to talk about why a slow, grinding naval operation, happening quietly out at sea, might be doing more long-term damage to Iran than any airstrike has managed so far. This isn't guesswork or speculation dressed up as fact. Everything here is built from official military statements, independent shipping data, and reporting from major financial and maritime outlets. So when we say 30 ships were turned away, or that this operation is costing hundreds of millions of dollars a day, those numbers are coming from real, trackable sources, not vague claims floating around online. Here's why this matters so much right now. Wars usually get remembered for their loudest moments. A missile strike, a building on fire, a dramatic video clip that spreads everywhere within hours. Those moments make headlines because they're visible, they're fast, and they're easy to understand in 10 seconds. But this blockade doesn't work like that. There's no fireball. There's no smoke rising over a city. It's just warships, quietly turning tankers around week after week with almost no cameras watching. And that's exactly why it's so easy to miss how serious this actually is. A slow economic squeeze doesn't trend on social media the way an explosion does, but slow doesn't mean weak. In fact, slow repeated pressure, applied constantly over months, can end up being far more damaging to a country's ability to function than a single dramatic strike ever could be. So over the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly how the US is enforcing this blockade on the water, what it's actually costing Iran in real dollars, and why this quiet, grinding form of pressure might be reshaping this entire war in ways most people haven't noticed yet. Because the real story here was never really about 30 ships. It's about what those 30 ships represent inside a much bigger, much quieter economic fight, happening just below the surface of the headlines. Picture 2 boxers circling each other, throwing punches, backing off, circling again. That's basically what's been happening in the waters near Iran since April. This blockade isn't a single move, it's round after round. And to understand why 30 ships getting turned away in 1 week is such a big deal, you need to understand the fight that led up to it. It started back in April, after peace talks between the UAEs and Iran fell apart in Islamabad. Once those talks collapsed, the United States shut the door on Iran's shipping lanes for the first time. That first blockade ran for about 2 months, and it worked. Iran's ability to move oil in and out of its own ports took a real hit. Iran responded the way you'd expect a cornered player to respond, by declaring the strait closed on its own terms and warning that any ship crossing without permission could be set on fire. Then for a short stretch, things cooled down. A ceasefire kicked in, the blockade lifted, and Iran's shipping came roaring back almost overnight. In just 3 weeks, Iran managed to export tens of millions of barrels of crude oil. On one single day, they reportedly moved 10 million barrels. That's how fast things can flip when the pressure lifts even a little. During that same window, Iran started charging ships up to $2 million just for safe passage through its waters, and in some cases, asking to be paid in Chinese currency instead of US dollars, a clear move to dodge sanctions tied to the dollar system. But that calm didn't last. In early July, Iran began attacking commercial ships passing through the strait again. Within about a week, the United States slammed the door shut a second time, and this time it was tighter. Any ship trying to enter or leave Iranian ports or coastal waters became a target for enforcement. Now, here's the part most people picture wrong. This isn't warships just floating around looking intimidating. This is an active, hands-on operation happening constantly, ship by ship. One day after the second blockade started, U.S. forces disabled an oil tanker by firing missiles directly into its smokestack, after the crew ignored repeated warnings. Think about that for a second. That's a weapon usually used against tanks and buildings, aimed with enough precision to cripple a ship without sinking it or killing anyone on board. That's not luck. That's a military showing exactly how controlled and deliberate this entire operation really is. Weeks earlier, during the first blockade, a fighter jet disabled another tanker by firing cannon rounds straight into its rudder, destroying its ability to steer. Again, the crew had ignored multiple warnings first. U.S. Marines have also boarded ships directly, climbing aboard to check cargo, verify paperwork, and confirm a ship's flag actually matches who really owns it. And it's working, at least in terms of behavior change. Independent tracking data has shown Iranian-linked tankers zigzagging near the edge of the strait, making full U-turns, or simply stopping dead in open water rather than risk getting caught. That tells you everything. Ship captains aren't taking chances anymore. They've watched what happens to the ships that do. Add it all up across both blockades, and the numbers get hard to ignore. American forces have intercepted 85 vessels total since this began. 3 ships have been seized outright. And by the U.S. government's own estimate, this blockade is costing Iran roughly $500 million a day in lost trade. Run that across just 1 month, and you're looking at losses of around $15 billion, hitting an economy that was already fragile long before this war even started. Iran hasn't just absorbed the hit quietly either. They've seized 2 cargo ships of their own in what looks like direct retaliation. But even with all this enforcement, it hasn't been airtight. Shipping intelligence firms estimate around 26 vessels managed to slip past the blockade entirely during the earlier stretch. And that gap, the space between ships caught and ships that got through, is where the real story starts. Because Iran didn't just sit back and accept this pressure. They built an entire system designed specifically to beat it. Every fighter under pressure eventually finds a way to slip punches, and Iran found theirs in the form of a fleet built to disappear. It's usually called the Shadow Fleet, sometimes the Ghost Fleet, and it isn't some small workaround. Analysts believe Iran is running something close to 170 of these ships, built for one purpose only: moving oil without getting caught. Here's how it actually works. These ships switch off their tracking beacons, the signal every legal ship is supposed to broadcast at all times, the moment they get anywhere near Iranian waters. They fly fake flags from countries they have no real connection to, sometimes backed by fake websites built to copy real shipping registries from places like Benin, Cameroon, or Chad, complete with fake paperwork good enough to pass a quick inspection. Out in open water, far from any port, they transfer oil from one ship to another, blending Iranian crude with cargo from other sources, so the paper trail gets muddy enough that a buyer down the line can claim they had no idea where it actually came from. One investigation that tracked over 200 voyages through the strait found that more than a third of all traffic during that stretch was tied directly or indirectly to Iran. 61 of those ships were on international sanctions lists at the exact moment they made the crossing. Some were caught actively jamming their own tracking signals just to slip through unseen. This has turned into a real, ongoing chase, and it's not exactly a fair one on either side. The U.S. Navy can stop a tanker and cripple its ability to steer in under 2 minutes. Iran's Shadow Fleet can spin up a brand new fake shipping registry overnight and have a renamed ship back out on the water within days. Neither side is winning outright, and honestly, neither probably ever fully will. But that friction is the whole point. Every ship forced to zigzag, turn back, or wait weeks for a safe window is a ship that isn't delivering oil on time. And in an economy that depends on predictable income, those delays add up fast. There's a human side to this that's easy to lose in all the numbers. While the US and Iran fight over which ships get through, real people are stuck in the middle with nowhere to go. At the height of the blockade, maritime officials estimated around 20,000 sailors were stranded aboard more than 3,000 ships, sitting motionless near the strait, unable to move forward and often unable to turn back either. That's roughly the population of a small town, floating in place, watching a war they have no part in and no control over. One sailor described his crew boiling water because their fresh drinking supply had already run out, just waiting to hear when a resupply might come. A ship's captain anchored nearby said his real fear wasn't the war itself, but not being able to evacuate his crew if the nearby port shut down completely. Global shipping organizations publicly pushed for emergency protection for these sailors, and during one short ceasefire, a temporary corridor did open, letting some of them finally leave. These aren't soldiers who signed up for a war zone. They're ordinary workers who ended up in the middle of one anyway. And behind all of this sits one massive reason Iran keeps pushing despite the losses. Oil isn't a side business for them, it's the entire foundation of their economy. Even under years of sanctions, Iran has kept exporting close to 1.6 million barrels of crude a day, up dramatically from a few 100,000 barrels back in 2020. That growth happened almost entirely because of the shadow fleet system, built patiently over years of sanctions pressure. And the biggest buyer keeping this whole system alive is China, which has kept purchasing discounted Iranian oil throughout the entire war, despite heavy pressure from Washington to stop. So, let's bring this back to where we started. That quiet, boring-sounding military update about 30 ships. Once you understand everything sitting underneath it, that number stops looking small. It starts looking like the visible tip of a much bigger, mostly invisible, economic siege. Every one of those 30 ships represents a shipment that didn't arrive, a payment that didn't clear, and one more small crack in an economy already worn down by years of sanctions and months of active war. None of that shows up in a dramatic video clip. There's no fireball, no smoke, no missile caught on camera. It's just a warship quietly turning a tanker around again and again, week after week, until the weight of thousands of small denials starts to genuinely bend a country's ability to function. And that's exactly why this update deserved more attention than it got, because the real story was never really about 30 ships. It's about what those 30 ships represent inside a system that has already intercepted 85. Vessels total seized 3 outright and is reportedly draining $500 million a day out of an economy that was already stretched thin before this war even began. Here's the bigger picture worth sitting with. A blockade like this, quiet and unglamorous compared to airstrikes, might actually be one of the most effective pressure points in this entire war, simply because it can be sustained in a way that bombing campaigns can't. You can only strike a country's military targets, so many times before you run out of new ones to hit, and expensive missiles only stretch a budget so far. A naval blockade doesn't hit that same wall. Ships get turned away or disabled using far cheaper tools, and the pressure builds day after day instead of resetting between attacks. The trade-off is speed. $500 million a day sounds massive, and it is, but it's the kind of number that wears a government down slowly over months, not the kind that forces a sudden surrender overnight. A leader can point to a successful airstrike and call it a win, the same night, with footage ready for the evening news. Nobody gets to point at a single rerouted tanker and call the war over, even though 30 of them added up in a single week might matter more to how this conflict eventually plays out. This also says something bigger about the real limits of military power here. The United States Navy is, without exaggeration, the strongest naval force in history, and it still can't fully seal off a determined country from the global shipping system. Not when China keeps buying, not when fake shipping registries can be built faster than they can be shut down, not when over 100 aging tankers are willing to go dark and gamble on slipping through unnoticed. That doesn't mean the blockade is failing. 85 intercepted ships and $500 million a day is a serious toll by any measure, but it does mean this is shaping up to be a long, grinding fight, rather than something settled by one decisive move. It's also worth remembering where these numbers are coming from. Every figure here, 85 intercepted, 30 turned away in a single week, $500 million a day, comes from the US government's own reporting on its own operation. That doesn't make the numbers false, but it does mean we're mostly seeing this fight through the eyes of the side enforcing it. And Iran's own version of how much trade is still getting through would likely tell a very different story. So what actually happens next is still an open question, and it's worth watching closely. Keep an eye on whether China keeps absorbing discounted Iranian oil despite the risk, because as long as one reliable buyer keeps showing up, Iran always has somewhere to sell. Keep an eye on how far sanctions targeting the shadow fleet's banks, insurers, and shipping companies actually go, because that pressure doesn't need a single warship anywhere near the strait to work. And keep an eye on whether Iran's shadow fleet system, now overlapping heavily with Russia's, starts drawing more direct international attention as one shared weak point serving 2 sanctioned countries at once. Because in the end, this was never a story that gets settled by one dramatic strike. It's a slow, quiet siege, playing out one intercepted ship at a time, and the numbers buried in a boring press release last Friday might end up telling us more about how this war ends than any missile fired so far.